have a good number of participants who joined us today. So, hello everyone, good evening, and welcome to Talking About Transitions. Today, we're going to explore how climate change is reshaping childhood, and I'm Nupur Khante, your moderator for today. My work focuses on climate adaptation, sustainability, and human centered design. For those joining us for the first time, Transitions Research is a social science collective, and Talking About Transitions hosts conversations on systemic shifts at the intersection of technology, society, and sustainability. Climate change is not just an environmental problem today, it's social and developmental. Imagine months too hot to play outside, stormy nights, flooded schools, and the constant fear of what the next season brings. Climate shocks and slow onset changes cause visible harms and also deeper, perhaps less visible losses. Some of these are easier to see and measure, like classrooms damaged by floods, more children missing school, spikes in waterborne diseases, and worsening health outcomes. But other losses, though less visible, are just as real, like prolonged anxiety and trauma, missed rites and festivals that connect children to their culture, shrinking safe spaces for play, and adolescents losing their sense of agency as they're forced to take on household responsibilities. When schooling, nutrition, health, play, and learning are repeatedly disrupted, these effects compound. Without centering children's experiences in research and policy, the next generation will face both immediate harms and also lifelong disadvantages. Our conversation today aims to build a tangible, textured narrative of how rising temperatures, floods, and water stress are reshaping children's lives and what is quietly being lost. Today, we'll explore this through three perspectives. First up, we have Dr. Fatima Bakhtiar. Dr. Fatima is a senior researcher at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center with over 15 years of experience in research and project management across diverse cultural, geographical contexts. She leads the center's work on loss and damage, coordinating efforts to develop robust methodologies and operational frameworks, with a particular loss on non-economic loss and damage for vulnerable groups like the youth. Her work supports countries in incorporating loss and damage into national planning and policy processes, with an emphasis on inclusive, locally led, and evidence-based approaches. Next up, we have Dr. Ritika Revati Subramanian. Dr. Ritika is a senior research associate at the School of Global Development, University of East Anglia. In collaboration with local research institutions and communities across Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and India, she studies how climate change influences mobility and adaptation strategies. Over the past 15 years, she has worked as an ethnographer and journalist, focusing on gender, labor migration, and climate adaptation. She leads the Climate Rights Project and podcast, which investigates how climate change is deepening the drivers of child marriage in South Asia. We are also joined by Janani Shekhar. Janani leads Angan Trust's work on children and climate action. She focuses on building awareness about the link between climate events and the violence and exploitation faced by children. Her work places vulnerable children, their safety, protection, and well-being at the heart of climate action, while encouraging multiple stakeholders to adopt a child-centric lens in their policies and programs. Janani brings over 15 years of professional experience, beginning her career as a lawyer, and then driven by a commitment to child protection, she transitioned to the development sector. Thank you to all three of you for making the time and joining us today for this extremely critical conversation. We're really excited to get started. So we'll begin the session with a discussion. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll take them in the last 10 minutes of the session. I'd like to begin with an opening question to all three panelists. From where you sit, whether in policy or research or practice, what is the most pressing way climate change is reshaping childhood today? Perhaps we could do it in the order of introductions. Fatima, if you go first, that would be lovely.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me today. Hello, everyone. So I have been introduced. My name is Fatima Bakhtiari. I'm from UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. We have been working together with Research Transition, the different projects related to the loss and damage and use Also with the other countries, I do have some experience of working in the area of loss and damage, specifically for making a framework and developing best practice indicator to track the effect of climate change, especially the loss and damage on children. But just to answer or the opening of this question, I would like to also address or draw our attention to the critical concept of climate overshoot. You know, a scenario in which that global warming go beyond internationally agreed thresholds that we all know is 1.5 or 2 degree before eventually returning to the safer level. So there will be a temporary period of overshoot that significantly elevates and prolongs children's exposure to both intensified extreme events and also the dangerous slow onset changes. So this is not like a distance risk that we are talking about. This is a reality, and we are facing it very, very closely and very near to us. So for millions of children, overshoot shapes the very environment in which they must grow, learn, and imagine their future. So from a policy and research perspective, the most urgent reality is the unequal escalation of the climate risk that now define the childhood. So over half of today's children, unfortunately, will face most intense heat wave, floods, drought, and storms that any previous generation. In my generation, in my childhood, I remember some, but nowadays you see all this news every day about this climate disaster. And even if the global targets are going to meet, that is, it's not very likely. Hopefully, we will meet all this commitment, but there will be a still time that we have to address all this residual impact, all this disaster, and we have to have a plan for that. So then also related to the slow onset crisis that although we do have the adaptation efforts in place, there will be still some limitation to what we can adopt to hard limit and soft limit. And then there still will be some impact that we really need to address them, like droughts, salinization, sea level rise, that are silently erode food security, force school dropouts, fraction of the family and cultural continuity due to the displacement. And the heaviest burden falls, unfortunately, on the children that they are the least responsible and least protected. Those living in the poverty, conflict, and displacement are even more in the danger or facing the danger and suffer from the climate change. So the consequences are both physical and also psychological. I was reading, there was like a global survey that 60% of youth people reported that severe climate anxiety with daily effect on their well-being and strong feelings of injustice. And they were even saying that they feel that their parents' generation are the one responsible for that. So it was like a sort of also anger. It was not really nice reading all that, but it's all pointing out that we need to be prepared and plan for that. So when children live under this constant threat, both from the sudden and extreme event and also a slow onset event, the loss extend beyond the asset and opportunity is the loss of hope, and that's very dangerous. So our challenge now is clear to make this risk visible and design truly child-centered policies and act with urgency before this damage become irreversible and also the generational. So that's what I can come up with. Thank you.
Thank you so much for opening it up like that, Fatima. The callbacks to kind of recognizing the reality that is going to occur, and I think even the framing of least responsible, most affected, and these mixed feelings of anxiety, anger, but then also hope, and how does that interplay in a child's mind, I think was really sort of something to give us to think with. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ritika, on how you faced in your work. What have you seen as the kind of most urgent or pressing way?
Right. I think to thank you so much for having me here. I think to just respond to your question in terms of how it is reshaping childhood, I think One key aspect is that in our part of the world, even though there are legal definitions of who is a child and, they're very age based, childhood as an experience or as a stage in life itself has always been socially constructed and is also a negotiated space. And that's where I think what climate change does or has been doing is in a way, whether through, as Fatima said, through rapid, disasters or slow onset crises, is that it is further, collapsing that gap between childhood and assumed adulthood, wherein you're entering the world of labor, you're taking on adult roles like caregiving or income generation or marriage early on. So I think to sum it up, I think climate change is not just reshaping childhood or altering childhood. I think it is abbreviating it, and that's where I think I'd end my comment here.
I think that's a powerful statement to make of the abbreviation of childhood. And it's a really nice way to sum up, I think, how climate change is affecting children. Would love to hear your thoughts on this as well, Janani.
Yeah, so I'll obviously try and bring in Angan's view on this because we are a child protection organization. We've done child protection work for over 22 years now, and we are seeing, according to me, there are two pressing ways in which climate change is reshaping childhood. One is that there is a there's a redefinition of vulnerability itself, what vulnerability is meaning for families and for children. So in just the last 20 years, we've had a 5x increase in disasters, that more than what we had in the last 100 years before that. And this increased frequency and intensity and unpredictability of disasters is exacerbating vulnerability at alarming rates for families and therefore for children. So one is there's a complete, what could be a coping mechanism which was adopted once in, say, 10 years by a family, now gets adopted every now and then because climate is reshaping adaptive capabilities, eroding, systems that keep families protected and together, and therefore resulting in harm for children. And the second thing that we are noticing a lot through our work is the complete disintegration of a family fabric, right? Climate-induced migration is a reality in most vulnerable, families. And we are seeing, like Ritika also mentioned, it's that assumption of adulthood very early, climate-induced migration, parents working more means safety nets for children. Everything that's comfortable, secure, and dependable for a child is being taken away far too early, and children are assuming adult roles far too early, and they are basically losing out on childhood itself. And so from our perspective, the entire community, your care systems and the fabric of a family is completely getting destroyed at a far more alarming rate than what it was happening before.
That's a very critical observation, that if it's eroding the fabric of a family, then kind of relationships are changing and the pressure ultimately is falling on children, even if it's not intentional, it's just what's happening, right? And I'd love for you to elaborate, Janani, from Angan's work specifically. How have you seen climate change disrupting kind of these everyday lives? Like, I know we talk about sort of impacts on their schooling, their health, safety, whether they have access to playgrounds, but I'd really love to hear some sort of stories or narratives of work in the field, some examples you might have to share with us of what kind of children or communities you've been able to work with.
Yeah, so a lot of our climate and child protection work is, originating from the Sundarbans region in West Bengal. It's a highly climate and child vulnerable zone. And what we've noticed in the last 10 years, due to repeated cyclonic activity and climate, events occurring in that region, is that families are in a consistent state of, experiencing a disaster, recovering from it, and experiencing the next one. So there's consistent precarity and vulnerability. There's consistent erosion of adaptive capability, which over time then means that a flood is enough to destroy an entire family, and maybe a cyclone takes, to destroy another family, and a gust of wind is all it takes to destroy one sitting at the banks of a river. So we've seen that steady erosion happening, and therefore the exacerbation of violence and exploitation risk for children. Climate is not operating in a silo. It's, of course, affecting every aspect of a child's life, but we do feel that a lot of the safety and well-being elements are not seen directly because they are not as measurable and as visible as, say, a child losing access to school or through a healthcare system or to food. These are slower, long-term repercussions of disasters and family vulnerability and reduced adaptive capabilities. And so we are seeing more children going into labor. We are seeing more decisions to marry children. There are more decisions to migrate, either through family migration, children are migrating individually. And as I mentioned before, that complete construct of breakdown of a family system, it's not like families migrate nicely together and they have a great life where they go. Every place is being affected by climate, right? So there's no clean migration. There are no clean alternate livelihood options in climate impacted zones. And so for children, we are seeing escalation of labor and marriage and unsafe migration, but we're also seeing communities talk about mental well-being issues for children. It's not something they've spoken about before. As Fatima had also mentioned, there is an anxiety. Children are afraid to go back to school because schools are used as storm shelters. There's no, at a very hyper-local level, right? Climate change is such an abstract scientific concept. There's no socialization of what it means in the then and now for the people who are suffering that, and for children especially. Hear an alarm, early warning system, and they panic. They have a traumatic experience in a safe shelter, and that just repeats every time they have to go back to that shelter. And systems are not designed for them. So we are seeing a lot of that. And then there are some emerging risks. We are seeing children, feeling hopeless, feeling like there is nothing left for them in where they are, and therefore maybe running away or looking for some alternative options may be better for them. There is loneliness, there is escapism, there are all these things that probably they are not able to articulate as related to climate, but because of our lens and the lens through which we are operating, we kind of see that connection. And I think those, Fatima had very clearly and very well articulated, expression. It's the loss of hope. And that's a dangerous one for a young generation to grow up with a loss of hope. That's something, that we need to worry about.
Yeah, I think that's so critical how even thinking about the spaces that are meant to be built for them, like a school, and that if the role of that space changes and it becomes unsafe, then how do you tell them to go back and learn there? It's this sort of deepening of, and I also think this was something that came up in our research also. How do you draw this connection between what's happening to children and how much of climate change is got to do with it? So that's also really interesting. And I think that's where I think my next question to Fatima comes in is how do we sort of record these losses? Like loss and damage frameworks are now becoming very critical to climate policy. We're talking about loss and damage as a separate area in climate change and impact. But from your work in cities and with countries and at the national level, how do you think children's experiences and losses are they being identified? Are they being recorded at all? And if at all, like what are the gaps there? How can we do better at even just identifying and recording what's happening to children?
Yeah, thank you, Napur. I think that's a very important question when it comes to gathering data and evidence for policymaker and make the policy work. We need data and we need to be able to record the evidence. So from what I have learned working with different countries in the area of loss and damage and looking into the different vulnerable group, especially youth and children in particular. So I would say that most cities and countries rely on sectoral and evidence-based data in loss and damage framework and using usually public health surveillance, school attendance record, disaster registration, to track the official impact. However, these tools are only partially capture the visible economic loss and in my opinion, nearly always leave out the profound and non-economic. I know you don't like that terminology of non-economic, but by non-economic, I would say the impact that they are not easy to put a price on it. So like a loss of life, for example, they categorize, or loss of culture, loss of language. So they are all non-economic impact and psychological harms that especially those magnifies by, as I said, the overshoot the area and also the Sloan said event. So a major structural issue that I can come up with is that in global reporting tools like PDNA report that I think most of us familiar with, the post-disaster needs assessment, They're widely adopted for disaster impact assessment and they don't require child-specific disaggregation. And as a result, even after a major disaster, we know, okay, how many schools were damaged, but we rarely know, or the policymaker rarely knows that how many children lost culturally vital spaces or suffered trauma or drop out or face child marriage or long-term displacement. So other critical gaps include when it comes to disaggregations, most reporting lacks detail on children age, gender, disability, or compound vulnerability. So policymakers are blind to which subgroups are hardest hit or left behind. I'm talking about disability because those disabled children, they are faced with a major and hardest effect of the climate change, and they usually not just the children but in general disabled people that are in the category of vulnerable people already, so they face even more, and we are not able to reflect that in our data and ultimately in the policy. Also about the invisible slow onset losses, pDNA and similar tools rarely address the losses that accurate over years, such as educational disruptions from a persistent drought, chronic anxiety from ongoing glacial melt in the context of Nordic, or cultural erosion from salinization or sea level rise. So there are some updates from the VIM XCOM or UNFCCC's the tools, the mechanism that are in place. Right now, there are going to have some update and add the component of a slow onset and also non-economic loss for the available tools that countries be able to gather those kind of data and record and combine it with the other form of data gathering when it comes to the extreme event and economic losses to be able to provide a full picture of the impact. So hopefully with this improvement in methodology, we are able to capture that aspect as well. The other part that there is a gap is about the children's lived experience and perspective that are rarely incorporated through participatory methodologies and leaving these priorities and needs invisible. So as I heard from other panelists, Ritika and Janine, so you already mentioned that there are children that they are experiencing all of this, you articulated very well, all this impact, but rarely we see that they have been incorporated in the data gathering, like different methodology like storytelling and all these qualitative methodologies that's available. They ask children or they approach children. Sometimes I know there are some rules and you have to follow some ethics, but because of that, so some organization, because they are not aware of that, they actually don't go to that route. They think that there are some limitation and okay, let's just leave it out and we don't want to. But that's not the way we should go. We should be brave enough to go to this field and talk and reflect the children life experience and perspective in that. The good news is that when I participate in different during the COPs and also the SPs in Bonn and meet with different countries heads and ministries, I could hear that there are some countries that they have started including a youth focal point in there when they are putting together their NDCs and NAPs, that focal person like reflect the perspective and experience of the youth into the decision-making process. So that's a very, very good progress that it's there, but it has to be more in an inclusive way and also the larger scale for other countries as well. The other, or the one of the last point that I wanted to make is about, I think I mentioned it before, is about children facing overlapping risk. And I think Ritika, you mentioned it, and Janine, you also talked about it, that such being in both disabled and displaced after a flood or experiencing flood after flood, or a younger experiencing early marriage after a series of food crises. So these are remain doubly or triply invisible. So that is like adding the vulnerability or exacerbate the vulnerability that they already had, and they now face with even more vulnerability. We have done a research at the center. We looked into the different adaptation plan of different country. We reviewed 53 national adaptation plan, and we found most referenced children only as a vulnerable group with almost no specific policy commitment, actionable measures, or data pathway tailored to the multidimensional loss and damage children face. So, and that's unfortunate. So we hope that like within the new round of NDCs and NAPs, we come up with some better and robust understanding that the country really go to much more detail and reflect children in their commitment. So by addressing all these gaps that I mentioned, so hopefully we see much more progress in the area of policies, child responsive policies. Thank you.
Fatima, that was so insightful. I think all of these are so specific and experiences that you'd only know when you do a PDNA of what this looks like. And I think this is a recurring theme of this overlapping risk, cascading impacts, what happens after one event and then another event, and then the long-term impact. It just goes on to show how complicated this is, but that ultimately who bears the brunt of it is sort of it. And that's actually a brilliant segue to the next point, because I think Ritika is at the heart of doing some participatory work on trying to impact this. So to Ritika, then my next question of your research makes visible the sort of gender impacts of climate change and the experience of adolescent girls under climate stress. So how, in your work, how have you found it to change and impact their daily lives and choices? And what does it mean for, how do they get educated? What does it mean for their right to safety, for their right to learn, to grow up in a free world? And what are the state of their rights in general in this precarious situation?
Right. Thank you so much. I think one key aspect before I, directly respond to your question, I think it's important to make this clear that, it's very difficult, especially on the ground, I think, and for all of us also doing research, it's very difficult to attribute a lot of things happening on the ground directly to climate change. And that's a very risky terrain to sort of say everything was ideal and, suddenly we have these events and things have turned up, have upturned. So in a way, building these causal connections can also be quite risky, and which is one thing that I think is very important to sort of understand. It's a very political, deeply political problem. Like, I mean, we are talking about the way in which climate change is deepening existing drivers of a lot of issues that we are seeing. So I just wanted to highlight that being very crucial in terms of attribution is quite challenging, and it's also quite risky, in terms of succumbing to very simplistic narratives. So that is something which I think is very important. And I'm saying this because, for instance, as part of my work, I mean, as part of my doctoral research, as also as part of the Climate Brides project that we've been building, one of the things that we've been trying to focus on is look at how climate change is deepening existing drivers of child marriage in South Asia. And this is an issue which, and child marriage is not a new institution. I mean, it is an institution which has dated centuries. But having said that, with activism, with changes in legal policy and other things, we've been seeing a sharp decline in the numbers. But there are certain regions which continue to report high numbers even now. So that's where the starting point was, to try and understand why are these numbers so alarmingly high. So, for instance, in Western India, where I did my doctoral research and where I'm from, in Maharashtra, for instance, in Western India, there are certain regions where even today the prevalence of child marriage rates reported is at 40%. Whereas the rest of the country has even come down to like 23, 24%. So, we are seeing very high numbers. Now, of course, it would be risky to sort of say everything is, and one thing that stands out is this region is historically drought prone, drought affected. Of course, it's risky to sort of say that drought is responsible for all the high numbers. But having said that, one thing that we've been seeing, and going back to your question around labor, is that marriage is a labor arrangement essentially, is that, over a period of time, because this is one region where it has been historically drought prone, the industry around drought has also developed in a way wherein they're able to use drought as a way to even incur profit. So, for instance, to simplify it, this is a region which is also seeing a high prevalence of sugarcane cultivation, which is a high water guzzling crop. But early on, say in the 1960s, recruitments used to take place only with male gang members who used to go. But over a period of time, they've also changed the arrangement into marriage-based units. Sort of saying with marriage, you create a labor unit and you can go. So, with increased intensity and frequency of droughts, we're seeing labor patterns change in industries, where industry is a very important part of this climate change conversation. And on the other hand, we're also seeing that marriage, which is already an institution providing, food, providing water, providing general care, security, everything for a household, has been encashed. So here we're seeing a rise because there's an entire industry that has come to be. But whereas in cases, say in Bangladesh, where we've done interviews for our podcast, there are relief camps, for instance, wherein with urgent, intense, like cyclones, like Cyclone Amphan, for instance, overnight families were pushed into, relief camps. And over here, there's a question of security, deep insecurity, deep sexual threats of sexual violence, for instance, where then marriage becomes a prospect to provide that sense of security and protection. Where their marriage takes on another form. I mean, that becomes a central aim. Whereas in Afghanistan, for instance, we were doing an interview with a journalist from the internally displaced persons camps. One thing that stood out was that bright price became an important economic incentive to ensure that there is food, livestock, etc. for the family. So in a way, I think what is important to understand that is that climate change takes on different forms, and creates, it's a crisis of care, it's a crisis of protection, and I think, and a crisis of labor. So I think that's something that I'd want us to reflect on further as well. Yeah.
I think that's like a really insightful way to think about it, which is creates this crisis which leads to unexpected situations and they don't manifest the same way everywhere. So even kind of solutions of getting towards that. Just wanted to briefly follow up on that. Are there any methods that you used or what have you seen, sort of participatory methods as a follow-up to Fatima also, and I'd love for anyone else to come in, is we shouldn't not go and engage with children because there are certain kind of methods of engagement or good practices to follow. So in your experience, have you seen any participatory methods that have been effective at capturing these experiences?
Yeah, sure. I think so. One of the methods that I use as for part of my research has been intergenerational interviews and intergenerational sort of conversations, because to sort of see that it's not a sudden sort of, because I think in our part of the world, we've been seeing such experiences for years now. It's not a sudden problem. I mean, we've not articulated it as climate change, but I think it is something we've been seeing. It's a question of governance, etc., all of that. So I think intergenerational conversations has been very, very helpful, bringing in like different. So for instance, even though age at marriage, I'm just speaking about child marriage, has been increasing. Like, say in the same household, the grandmother was married at 8, vis-a-vis the granddaughter-in-law is married at 15. We can see an increase in age at marriage, but then the gap between marriage and saying join the labor force or, has actually reduced. So that in a way to also see these trends or changes, we have to see it intergenerationally. And the second thing I think is very useful, which we're using as part of our current work on climate mobility, is around scenario planning and, in terms of also foresight and scenario work, wherein you're trying to understand what and bring in different stakeholders, including children actually, to try and understand what would different scenarios imply and what would the world look like. And I think that kind of participatory work, bringing in different voices, I think is quite crucial, because I think it's a whole of society problem in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful point of just seeing in one family how that's changed and then doing these sort of other exercises. That also brings us to sort of one of the ideas for today's conversation was, while we recognize the impacts and they're really important and critical to note down, what are pathways to resilience? Like how do we do better, right? How do we do better by these children and how do we kind of minimize what's happening and safeguard their right to safety? So with that lens, I'd just like to my next question to Fatima, which is from a funder and sort of policy maker or policy guider standpoint, what are some realistic entry points for channeling finance towards child-centered loss and damage measures? We're increasingly seeing a lot of loss and damage funds, but how do we, and to kind of build on what you said, how do we move away from just calling them a vulnerable group? And how do we really center finance to research and practice to protect children?
Yeah, that's an important question, and it's also a bit difficult to really come up with like a one size fit all answer to that. But as you know, the urgency and the magnitude of the finance gap have been more consequential for children's always. But the window of action is narrowing fast. But in my understanding, the pathway to be more effective and equitable funding for children or children-centered loss and damage measures, if it is within the reach, if policy, philanthropies, and market actors are acting decisively. So there are some entry points, as you mentioned. For example, mainstreaming child-centered outcome in all climate financing. So for every adaptation and loss and damage grant or fund that must embed a specific non-negotiable indicator that tracks children's health, education, continuity, nutrition, psychological well-being, and safety for both the rapid and a slow onset scenario. So that's the way it has to be. Unfortunately, right now, there's not such an indicator in place, but it has to be. And I'm talking about grants. It's because right now the talk of the loss and damage or fund for responding to loss and damage countries, they are very much pushing for this sort of fund when it comes to loss and damage. For adaptation, there are other sort of financial mechanism in place, but for specifically for the loss and damage, we talk about grant. So at least those indicators should be tailored by and disaggregated by age, gender, and context. So funding flows directly support child development, learning, trauma recovery, and social inclusion, not just the generic infrastructure. So they really need to be tailored to specific needs. And national climate funds and large donors should make eligibility for climate finance conditional on tracking and reporting this outcome. This part, it's not there yet, and it has to be. So if we are able to track how the money has been spent, so then we are able to really have a better reporting and monitoring that for the future fund, how to act better when it comes to children. The other point is that creating dedicated and flexible funding window. I would say that from the experience in some countries like Fiji and Vietnam, they demonstrated how locally managed school and community contingency funds enable rapid and tailored response after some disaster like cyclone, heat waves, and flooding. And such funds do not just support immediate relief, but they guarantee long-term recovery, restoring schools attendance, providing psychological supports, and replacing lost learning or protective community spaces. And also, there is a part that is missing, but they are going to develop on that, looking into the invisible cost. So the cost that is coming from the mental health services and also the interim teachers and safety space for play. So having those dedicated and flexible funding there and learning from these countries and scaling it up to other countries or in general at the global space, so it can create a really good entry or entry point for looking into the children fund or a specific use fund. The other part is, I would say, is integrating social protection with loss and damage grant finance. So adaptive social protection responses, such as those in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, they have delivered a targeted emergency cash, nutrition transfer, and psychological support to children and family displaced by hurricane and drought, for example. And linking the climate-triggered loss and damage funding with governments or humanitarian social protection system that ensures timely direct support reaches the most vulnerable children. So it means that, like, if we are able to create a basket of different funds with different scope and target them into the vulnerable group that we are thinking about, so that can facilitates and also speed up the process and the efficiency of the fund. and also being transparent and real-time and participatory monitoring, as I mentioned in other above. Like when we're looking into the Mexico and India, I was actually looking at in countries like Mexico and India, the new public dashboards show where money goes and to schools, health centers, and local communities. So families and civil societies can follow the money. So this helps community to push for timely and child-focused actions when climate risk exacerbates. So funders should support community-based monitoring that also the youth group can contribute in that monitoring process. Not just the technical expert provide this kind of a report. So it actually it's a really good model for also incorporating into the loss for the loss the fund for loss and damage, to be able to be very transparent and follow those indicators, and having a youth responsible for this monitoring efforts. So that could be also another way. And also transforming the global finance architecture in general. So the new research from World Bank in 24, I can see that it shows that even a modest increase in education adaptation investment, less than $20 per child, can dramatically reinforce learning, protection, and resilience. So this kind of estimation or monetizing of the co-benefit can encourage the investment and the private sector to come in play and invest in this kind of fund and this kind of activity. So this encouraging investment that advance both children well-being and climate adaptation, and including the green skills development, that is very key to be very much bold in that, because sometimes it's difficult for private sector to convince them for coming and make a business plan that it comes with a lot of benefit. But this way, or at least development of this methodology to really help them and show them what is the benefit of investing in that, can transform this global financing mechanism. And this should be complementary by policy and legal efforts to improve accountability and address this financial shortcut. Yeah, so I think I stop here. So thanks.
I absolutely love how you framed that, Fatima. There are so many methods of possible entry points, and ranging from even like what the government is doing to integrate social protection into grant funding, and then kind of reshaping global finance, but also like monetizing and giving these references of this is all we need. We need $20 a child to give them safe education, and that really helps push funding forward. And also about mental health and the use of dashboards. Another theme that I picked on to the panel discussion is because you all work in such different contexts that even different countries, and even in a country, different regions based on the disasters they face have different types of impact on children, I think. I'd love for you, Janani, to come in on what, because Angans work with so many kind of climate affected communities and have so many programs in place. What kind of research or evidence building do you think helps expand these programs that put children at the center, that are not kind of, just generic climate change programs or safety to climate, but how do we create evidence to expand programs like this?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a slightly different angle I'm going to take to this. Of course, the standard answer would be to have more data, right? Like everybody's talking about having more data that on, hyperlocal data on child vulnerability, climate vulnerability, to have a greater pool of evidence really in order to make it a central priority for people. But I think I'd like to take a spin on that and say that what we really do need is evidence of solutions that are actually really building resilience for children on the ground. So it would be great to understand if there's more understanding around what community systems of care could look like, or delivery of mental health services at a hyperlocal level could look like. Like, what does climate resilience building for children at the very base hyperlocal level look like? And it's important to have that from multiple stakeholders. Everybody is seeing the impact on children. I think we have to acknowledge that the impact of climate change on children is visible. It has to be acknowledged at a level where people feel it's important enough to address. I think that's the part that's missing. And, not for the future child, but for the child of today who's suffering the present climate risks. So, we just need to look at solutions, evidence on solutions, what works, what is actually impacting and changing things, and building resilience for children on the ground. We won't be, for people like us, we don't have climate solutions, and, we can't burden families with that. But what are child-centric solutions that are working? And it's an opportunity cost, really. If there are 3, 4 small fixes, and that gets people to say, yeah, we can do 3 things that through our work which will also impact children and in a positive way. I think those are things that can also encourage more people to invest in such programs and expand the programs as such. And I also think it would be interesting to know what cross-sectoral solutions and workings really look like, evidence of what works cross-sectorally, because obviously climate change it's not operating in a silo. We are having everything from, like, it's interesting, Fatima said that there should be something around conceptualization of education, nutrition, health, mental well-being, safety. Like, all of these are so interconnected the way we see them. A child in labor is a child not in school. A child in labor is a child who's not been getting some health and nutrition benefits and care and safety benefits. He is subject to this thing. And the same for a child who's married or a child who's a migrant. So there are such interconnected issues. It would be really good to see, how evidence of what can work cross-sectorally. And therefore, then there's a larger scope of impact. There's a larger scope of scalability. And, it's a far easier prospect to say that you're not just impacting one aspect of a child's life. This is something that can build overall resilience and, sort of benefit multiple aspects of a child's life. And of course, there is a standard. We do need hyperlocal disaggregated data. It helps it helps bring resources and allocations towards people who need it, and also in a way in which they need it. So there needs to be a more in-depth understanding of the local realities of what a climate event is doing to children, and therefore what those solutions and what resourcing and what budgeting and all of that looks like. But I think it's an ongoing thing. It would be interesting, really, from our standpoint, to see what are the solutions, because I know people belabor the problem a lot, but it's important to also look at, whether we can incorporate multiple solutions and get more people to then think that it is solvable. Because sometimes just highlighting the problem and not highlighting the solutions also stands in the way of program expansion and things like that, right? So it would be a good way to know how people are looking at it and build that database of solutions, and make it seem as something that is workable, for building resilience for children.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Janvi. I think kind of how I processed it is looking at it in 2 levels, where one, in general, in climate resilience programs, you're looking at child-centric measures and solutions and incorporating them in every sort of resilience measure. But then also, when you're designing child-specific solutions, you don't look at one sort of loss and we will target this and then we will target another one. And I think that's sort of responsive also to the reality of their impact, that it's not limited. Like, if a child has education loss, it's not just education, they're missing out on a whole bunch of other things. So I think it's a critical way to think of solutions also similarly. And I'd like to move on to Ritika now, of like, kind of, you've worked a lot on making this research also a tool for advocacy, for also using this to kind of create real world impact. So how, in your experience, what do you think works best to turn the evidence that we are creating, especially on adolescent girls and child marriage and so on, into real policy at different levels, whether it's at the national or the city level? How do we bridge that?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I think there are a couple of things. I mean, I'll quickly summarize a few of these ideas. And because it, like what Jarni pointed out, it is also done at various levels and looking at different audiences, because at the end of the day, everyone brings in different perspectives and different skill sets and different resources to a common problem that we're talking about. I think one thing that, just specifically speaking about the climate brides work, for instance, we started off with a podcast which was in English language, and the idea was to sort of talk about these issues, talk about child marriage in the context of climate change, talk about what climate change is doing in terms of existing socio-ecological drivers, socio-economic and other drivers. But then we realized very soon that, okay, the audience is limited because we're again speaking to a certain audience. And that's when we started working, with, illustrators, for instance, and what we've been doing is try and build educational material around climate change in the context of, say, increased labor burdens, talk about climate change in the context of gender inequality, in the context of reproductive health care. So, for instance, talk about it in different lenses and create, advocacy materials in different languages. So the idea was to sort of work with local translators, try and, translate some of these otherwise academic texts in ways that are, easily understandable in grassroots, collective languages. So that's something that we've been trying to do in terms of creating material itself, in terms of form of climate literacy, for instance. And marriage becomes an interesting vantage point because it covers so much ground. So that is something that we've been doing. The other thing, I think, in terms of in terms of other capacity, I think I've been working on this project with the University of East Anglia, and it's a broader consortium. We've been working closely with journalists because, I think it's very, very important to talk about narrative change itself, not create a very serious crisis narrative, and, not take away the other political aspects of the problem itself. Or like just have very, causal, like I was talking about earlier, very simplistic narratives as well. So we've been working with journalists, with climate scientists, and we created a guidebook called Shifting Grounds, to actually talk about how do you like what are some of the definitions that are, used in the climate science world, and how do you sort of make it accessible. So working with media, I think, is very, very crucial because they're a very key stakeholder in terms of building these narratives and ideas. And thirdly, I think, one key aspect, I think, is also bringing in the scientific aspects of climate change as well into the conversation, and, basically having an interdisciplinary conversation. So, we've been working, and I think, like, for example, University of Exeter last week had a recent study saying that when we've crossed the global tipping point, like the first tipping point itself, and wherein coral reefs, for instance, are at great risk. And these are conversations that we need to have very much with the social aspects of climate change as well, because so that we talk about it as one collective problem with different intersecting sort of, perspectives. So I think, yeah, bringing in those kind of collaborative, co-creative knowledges is what I think is also very, very important. Just to end, I think in that knowledge system, one thing that we miss out a lot is the knowledge of activism. I think a lot of work, I mean, over the years, even before we were calling it climate change, we've had like grassroots activists talking about it in the context of caste injustice, talking about it in the context of, feminist injustice, talking about resources and increased labor burdens. I think bringing in those voices which have existed and which are now also being used a lot by youth who are very much at the forefront of activism as well around climate, I think is very, very important. So in a way, I think just to sum it up, a more collaborative, interdisciplinary knowledge is what we're doing and we need to do as well.
I think that was such a strong context to set of what possible pathways look like, and also sort of activism, advocacy, and how do we go beyond creating accessible formats and languages and so on to talk about just these impacts on children. So we're nearing pretty much the end of our dialogue today. I just want to give some time in case anyone has any questions on the chat. We can perhaps take some of those. Just going to give everyone a minute. If not, I have a billion questions to ask. But I also just want to say, I think it's deeply inspiring to see the work that all three of you and your organizations have been doing to illuminate the impact that children have had. And I personally think it's really critical to reignite that sense of hope, right? Because if you're not looking towards possible solutions and pathways, then it just becomes a sort of morose documentation of impact. So I think that is also really critical and visible through all of your work is how do we push forward resilient pathways. So in case, while I'm just going to wait on the chat, I had a one quick kind of closing question, beginning with, I wanted to begin with the most pressing impact. And then now I want to kind of get into your personal views also on this, of your experiences. And if there was like one policy or program that governments or funders or organizations should prioritize to protect children's rights. We also understand that while we are, because of cascading impacts, there's a sense of prioritization. And what do you think from your context in this sort of future that we're seeing where tipping points are being reached? What's one program or policy that any of you can answer from any standpoint you come in that we should prioritize today?
I could take that and, well, I don't think there's like one policy or program. I think there's really taking a child-centered lens. Like from our standpoint, you need to child-proof climate change. You need to climate and child-proof development policies. Climate is giving us that opportunity to reframe a lot of things, to re-look at a lot of things. And I think having a child-centered approach, one, demands that you consider children as an independent category of affected people. Children are not to be subsumed within family units. They are independently affected. They need independent budgeting, resourcing, planning, acknowledgement that they have independent rights. And I think that's key. So irrespective of who you are, whatever kind of stakeholder you are, is your action impacting children? Is it taking something away from them? Is it giving something to them? Is it building resilience for children? Is it, creating new problems for children? If you're doing mitigation work, is it creating new problem for children? Are you taking away school systems by shutting down an entire coal plant? There are things that you can ask yourself, I think, but basically what we need is a child-centered thinking and lens. And we need to put that climate and child lens across policies, programs, actions, interventions, everything, right? And we really need to talk about the child of today. There is the future child who will probably not even exist if the child of today doesn't survive. So we need to have a climate stressed present and climate stressed future, and today's child and tomorrow's child both into consideration. And I just think that that child-centered lens where you look at all the needs of children, like we constantly see, right? Education, health, nutrition getting that priority, but safety and protection, families, it's a thing for the families to do, right? So reimagine that from our point of view as something that we need to reimagine how care systems work. We need to just not dump it on that already vulnerable family with very limited resources and that overburdened mother who's struggling to just figure everything out. So maybe it just, look at through that child-centric lens, what is the solutioning that you can come with? I think that is really key. Otherwise, there will be no child of tomorrow.
I think that's a very kind of textured understanding of what we consider important and what we don't, and just thinking about children through every decision of resilience that we make. Would love Ritika or Fatima, either of you, to kind of come in.
Thank you. Yeah, I very much agree with what you said, Janani. And just to complement, as you very much rightly said, there is no one policy, but if there is like a one imperative that like for governments and donors is to put children and youth at the heart of every climate decision, investment measure, to make them, as you said, child-proof. And also we must take the child sensitive targets, participation, not negotiable in all climate adaptation, loss and damage and disaster risk framework. And also every policy from the national action plan to global finance must include the clear indicator for children health, education and well-being. And that indicator should be developed together with all, not just the expert and practitioner, but also with the people, the local people and the children that they are affected the most. So, and also it's not just about the number. Those indicators should reflect the children's voices and ideas that must shape the path forward, how to react, what would be the solution, or how this is the expectation about solution. As you very much rightly mentioned, that our mitigation work or adaptation work, what are the negative impact? That is usually we forget to really articulate the negative impact when we are doing the impact assessment for climate policies, and we forget to come up with like a safeguard scenarios. How is that to address those negative impact? So, and also we need to guarantee youth participation from the community planning to international negotiation so that solution meets the real needs of them. And let's also invest for the long term and build resilience, green and inclusive services like schools, clinic protection, so children can do well, not just after the disaster, but every single day, no matter how climate changes. And in short, I would say protecting our children is securing our future. So child-centered climate action is no longer an option for us, or is not optional. It's a foundation of resilience for all of us, is a reality. So thank you.
Thank you, Fatima, for inviting that. Ritika, just in response to your answer, and perhaps if it's okay, I'll just read out the question that you were responding to, and we can illuminate us a little bit more. So we have a question that says, at a more personal level, how should climate-aware parents approach talking to their young children about climate change? How do we strike a balance between nurturing resilience versus burdening them with a sense of doom? And I would also just like to read out another question that similarly, what is the role of, beyond parents, what is the role of the community in helping children make sense of their changing realities? Would love Ritika to respond, and then Janani and Fatima, if you'd like to weigh in, that would be great.
Sure. I think just on a chat, I was, including some, very interesting children's literature around climate change that has been emerging, and they're fantastic books because it also at different levels of, age and reading capabilities. So I think, just to say that in this moment that we are, there has been a very sharp rise in art, illustration, looking at children's literature, which has emerged, which is talking about a lot of these issues with that right, sort of balance between creating a sense of doom and urgency, but at the same time also creating a sense of hope. And I think that is something which a lot of parents could engage with as very rich resources, which are also, there are a lot of resources online as well. So I think, yeah, engaging with alternative forms and creating space for these conversations are also very, very vital. The other thing that I'd want to, quickly add on to in terms of, creating that care network, I think it's really important that these are conversations and these are experiences which are community shared. And I mean, everyone is in the similar situation, but of course on different boats, as we saw during the pandemic. But I think it is a space wherein, one thing is I personally feel like the government has to do in more work in terms of, creating spaces for like caregiving or, creating safe, secure spaces. Like even Jani was talking about, there is a responsibility of the state as well. But for like community-led organizations, I think it's important to ask for help to sort of, build these resources, co-create and co-share these resources. Even platforms like this, just having the opportunity to talk and discuss, I think is very, very useful. So I think broadly co-creating some of these resources and having these different conversations from different lenses.
I think that was really insightful of what alternative approaches and perhaps more familiar to children approaches that feel more like hope to them look like. I just want to thank you all again for being a part of this. I've had a wonderful 1 hour discussing this critical subject with you, and I think I'm going to take away a lot of lessons. This loss of hope that you outlined, Fatima, that it's the most critical loss that we fail to account for. And what you said, Ritika, about the impact is not just reshaping, but it's abbreviating childhood in some sense and reducing what that looks like. And Janani, what your positive outlook of if we have to do this, all our programs of resilience have to have a child-centric lens, and how do we child-proof them so that we mitigate impacts that are creating. So just wanted to thank all of you for coming here today. I think this conversation's raised a lot of critical points of impacts, ways to measure and record them, and also like positive pathways or what solutions could look like for children. So want to thank all of you again. Want to leave it open for any closing statements if you'd like to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for
Thank you
having
so
me.
much. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. So we're also going to be kind of documenting all of the insights and the critical points you've raised, and I'll be in touch with you soon on that. But really, just really grateful for making the time today, and thank you for sharing your work and experience with us.